Hey everyone, welcome to lecture 1 of 5 for the replacement lectures for week 4 of Introduction to International Relations, Poly 12D, UCSD, summer of 2019. The main substance that we're going to be covering this week relates to how civil wars start. We've spent the last few weeks talking about threats to international peace. Now we're going to talk about threats to domestic peace. The Civil War literature sort of straddles the line between international relations and comparative politics. Lots of people who study international war, lots of the theories about international war come from international relations because this is sort of the locus of understanding of conflict logics, the logic of violence, the logic of when peace breaks down. Um, this set of lectures is going to rely a little bit on an understanding of a couple more of these behavioral games that we think are extremely important across the social sciences in a wide variety of subject matters. And so before we start on today's real substantive lecture on the macro level causes of civil war, I'm going to take a little while to talk through the prisoner's dilemma and the collective action problem. Okay, the prisoner's dilemma is sort of um, a popular concept. It's known in popular culture. You're probably, some of you, already a little bit familiar with it. Let's say that Omar is in a room with the bunk, and McNulty is out getting battered fish with Bodie. Bodie and Omar are accused of having robbed a bank, and Bunk and McNulty know that they don't have quite enough evidence to put either of them in jail for the full sentence, and so they offer Omar and Bodie a deal. The first one to rat out the other one can go free, and then they will use the evidence gleaned from the one of them that turns traitor to put the other one in jail for a long time. So if Bodie and Omar hold tight, they'll each get a light sentence, and if they both confess, they'll each get the full sentence. But if one rats on the other, then the rat goes free and the other one gets even a little bit longer in jail. So what's going to happen? If we lay this out so that the score on the left is what happens to player 1 and the score on the right is what happens to player 2, so here we can see that in a world where both Bodie and Omar cooperate with one another, they both get 1 year in jail. Where one of them turns the other one in, the person who defects gets 0 years, and the person who keeps up their end of the bargain gets 10 years. Um, what is the best possible outcome for our players in total? Right, the best mutual outcome for both of them is to lie. It's to hold up their end of the bargain and cooperate together. They each get 1 year in jail. That minimizes the total jail sentence that they will receive. Is this the most likely outcome? Well, the logic of the prisoner's dilemma says no. The logic of the prisoner's dilemma argues that a double defection, which maximizes the total amount of time the two spend in prison and definitely increases both of their individual sentences from the cooperate outcome, is the most likely. So why does this happen? Let's say that you're player 1. You don't know what your partner is going to choose, but you need to pick a strategy for yourself. The most rational thing to do is probably to look at how your choice affects your own outcome in a world where your partner keeps her end of the bargain and a world in which she defects or cheats. So you'll notice right away that no matter what your partner chooses, you spend less time in jail if you defect. The same is true for player 2. So if both parties are acting rationally and without regard for one another, we end up here with a double defection. Of course, being rational and being on the outside of the situation, we might look at the layout of the game, see the problem, and decide that what we need is a deal that moves us from the red box to the blue one. But this is the really evil part of the prisoner's dilemma. Let's say that Omar and Bodie make a deal on the outside. They tell one another, hey, look, I know what the prisoner's dilemma is. I know what's going to happen. We need to stay together. Let's both hold tight. We'll take our sentence, and then we'll get off and split the money later. But the second Omar is alone with the cops, Bodhi starts wondering about his logic. You all know where I'm headed, but I want to be ultra clear here and introduce a couple of vocab terms that might appear on a future exam. Here, Bodhi cooperates and Omar does not. Bodhi is the sucker, and we call this payoff in the game the sucker's cost. Who are the suckers the victims of? They're the victims of free riders, people who defect and rely on the cooperation or participation or work of others. So how might you actually solve this problem? Well, remember at the beginning of this entire course, we talked about the possibility that we could look at these abstract game structures and introduce an institution or a rule change that would change the incentives and therefore the way that the players are expected to behave. So one way that you might solve the prisoner's dilemma in a real-world organized crime problem is to hire an assassin. You hire an assassin who promises to murder anyone who walks out of jail scot-free on the assumption that they have cooperated with the state. And what we should expect now, in theory, is to see more cooperation because we've introduced a rule that eliminates the benefit to free riders. Now, defection is not a better option no matter what the other party chooses. In fact, defection is basically never a good option, right? So will we see more cooperation if we introduce assassins into this game, if we introduce people willing to kill defectors into this game, if we introduce essentially a government for organized crime into this game? Well, we'd have to test and observe, and we're not going to do that in this class, but I will tell you that there's a growing body of literature, sociology and political science, that examines the way that organized criminal groups function, and there is some evidence for the idea that introducing a meta-mafia, an organization that is willing to commit violence against drug trafficking organizations that are in competition with one another, is actually violence reducing and cooperation enhancing. And so we see that these markets for illicit goods really benefit when we introduce an assassin. So this is some evidence for this theory that collective action problems or prisoners' dilemmas are pernicious in managing relationships between criminals, and that you can actually ease those stresses by introducing an assassin. You can mitigate the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a two-player game, but this problem extends to multiple player games, or what we might call n-player games, n being the number of players in the game. And they describe a basic problem with achieving public goods. So let's start off by reviewing what public goods are. Those of you who have taken comparative politics or any sort of economics will hopefully remember this definition. The first element of a public good is that it is an asset that is non-rival, which means that one person using that asset does not make the asset less valuable to others. The value of that asset doesn't erode. Highways are a good example of a non-rival asset. Traffic builds up, and if you're all on the road at the same time, you might not get where you're going as quickly. But in general, having a system of roads is useful to you no matter how many other people use the roads, even if, and in fact maybe even because other people drive on them. Imagine the immense benefit that you get as a consumer from the fact that we have a road system that allows companies you buy from to move relatively quickly, or your family and your friends to get to you, or you to them, or vice versa. So having a road system is a good example of an asset that we can build and leave open to the community that is non-rival. So the second element of a true public good then is that it's not excludable. You can't prevent the public from taking advantage of these assets once they've been created. A police force is a good example of this. Once the police force is out patrolling the neighborhood and deterring crime, it doesn't really matter if someone has paid their taxes. criminals are deterred and their networks are disrupted and their plans are disrupted by virtue of having a police force. So even if you don't pay your taxes, even if somehow you can be identified as a tax cheat whom the police won't defend, there's still some amount of benefit you get from the public order that the police provide. Some number of other examples of public goods. Courts to settle disputes are extremely important. Here's an example of how courts function in a way that does not require you to actually access the court. Say that you and I are going to enter into a contract. You have a shoe store, I own a shoe manufacturing facility, and every month I send you 600 pairs of shoes and you send me $10,000. And 1 month you send me the $10,000 and I don't send you any shoes. In a world without a court system, well, let's start with a world with a court system. In a world with a court system, what would you do? Obviously, you would sue me. And it's important to note here that after you won your lawsuit because you performed your end of the bargain and I did not perform my end of the bargain, that at some point you could demand the money, demand the money, demand the money, and if I keep refusing to provide it, at some point you can get a document from the court that you can provide to the sheriff's office, and the sheriff will come and knock on my door with the butt of their guns and say, we're going to take property and sell it until this judgment has been fulfilled. Right? So in a universe where we have a court system, I already know that you have some kind of recourse against me. And so because I know that if I renege on my end of the contract, that I will end up getting sued and having my property taken, it makes cheating less attractive. Right? In a world without a court system, we'd have to duke it out. We'd have to have our private security forces duke it out. But because we live in a place where there's a court system, commerce is smoothed. And this is smoothed in anticipation of what the court could do to us. Right? We don't ever have to go to court, ever have to pay a fee to appear before a judge in order to feel the positive effect that having this public good provides. Okay. So let's say that we live in an anarchy of the every person provides for themselves kind of variety. It's somewhat chaotic. You're probably sick of having your car broken into. And a nice young lady comes to the door and she's asking money for the police. And let's pretend for the sake of argument that we know that this is not the Simpsons monorail episode or something. She's not going to take your money and then run away. But what she says is, listen, if I can get 80% of the people in this neighborhood to provide $5 a month for the police, we'll be able to buy a car, hire a couple of cops that can patrol the neighborhood, that can keep everyone's property safe. You prefer to have the police. You prefer having some sort of law enforcement to the chaos you currently live in. Would it be rational for you to pay the $5 a month to get the police? Well, the answer is, of course, no, right? If you pay and everyone else pays, you will get the police. But it would be pretty easy for you not to pay, and because the police are a public good, you would still get the benefit. And perhaps more importantly, your donation is not likely to be the one that brings you up over 80%. Your participation doesn't actually have a great deal of impact on whether or not the police are provided. Because you know that you could get away with experiencing the benefits of having a police force without providing payment, and because you know your neighbors are all thinking the same thing, you are incentivized to avoid the sucker's payoff. That is the payoff where you provide your donation and then there are no police because everybody else defects. You're incentivized to avoid that outcome by not paying, and there's relatively little cost to you by taking on that decision, right? Either you're going to get the benefit of the police because 80% of your neighbors donated anyway, or the deal would have collapsed anyway and you would have been left holding the bag. So let's take a look at what each box means, right? Here, where everyone pays, the services are provided, that's an easy box. Here, no one pays, services are not provided. Here, you're the free rider, right? Notice that your payoff is higher because you did not pay the money in, but you did get the services from the police. And here, you're the sucker. You paid in your money, which in this example is worth 1 point. No one else pays. No one gets the benefit of the police. You're just out money. Okay, so keep this logic in mind. Just as a sidebar, this is the book from which this concept is most thoroughly developed, Mansur Olson's Logic of Collective Action. Olson applied this collective action problem logic to a number of political problems. Voting, why don't people vote? Why do people litter? All these sorts of problems, he argues, are rooted in the fact that we all expect our neighbors to defect, and because our neighbors are likely to defect, we're never going to experience the benefits of the collective action anyway, and we will be suckers. And if we do the bad thing and everyone else somehow magically comes together and does it for us, we're still going to get the benefits of these outcomes. Okay, so in addition to laying out this rather dire problem, Olson provides us with a handful of potential solutions to the collective action problem. One potential solution is that you have a political entrepreneur. That political entrepreneur has an idea. The basic exchange here is that we expect everyone in a community to exchange money for a public good. And we know that it's tempting not to provide the money for the public good. It's tempting to defect because we don't want to be the suckers if the public good isn't provided. And if the public good is provided, we know that we could probably free ride. So the entrepreneur says, well, what we ought to do is provide to people who pay in not only the public good, but a free exclusive gift. Some side service that is not public, that we can target, right? And so now we have some way to incentivize people to participate individually. We see examples of this in the real world, right? Every NPR pledge drive that offers to give away a tote bag is linking an obvious public good to a selective incentive. We all know that we don't need to donate to NPR to continue to listen to it. And we all know that if we donate and NPR goes off the air, they're not going to refund our money. So we worry about being suckers, and we think that we might be able to get away with free riding, and so NPR has this problem. Now, somehow, surprisingly, NPR continues to get the money. Maybe it's the tote bags. Maybe it's the Cold War Kids Christmas album. I don't know. We can see, in principle, though, how providing these benefits, these additional private benefits, changes the payoff structure. Right now we have a world in which you not paying, assuming that you value this good at 2 units, actually leaves you worse off than if you paid. And even if you pay and the public service isn't provided, the selective benefit that you get is still there for you to take advantage of. And so your strategy changes because the payoff structure has changed. It always makes sense to pay in the way that I've stylized this game. Now, of course, in this circumstance, I am assuming that the tote bag is worth $2 to you in a world where the public service is worth $5 to you. This is another theoretical assumption I'm making to illustrate the abstract point. In the real world, you'd want to know the extent to which these selective services are actually incentivizing. What value do people actually assign to these things? Is it enough, in principle, to get people to donate? The job of the political entrepreneur in this solution is to come up with a selective incentive that is so valuable to potential donors that they're willing to take it, yet costs so little to the political entrepreneur that they can provide the selective benefit without undermining their chances to provide the public good, right? If the tote bags cost so much money that NPR can't hire any DJs, then you've essentially replaced the public good with the private good, and you're going to have people who are just buying tote bags. You're in the tote bag business now. You're not providing any sort of public good. So you need to somehow endow your selective benefit with a value that's beyond the amount of money you're paying for it. That's why you stitch NPR on the outside of the tote bags, because it's not just a tote bag then. It's a symbol that you can carry out into the world that you're not a free rider, right? You can rub it in the faces of everyone who refuses to donate to NPR that you're carrying them, right? And that sort of feel good, um, liberal smugness is part of the product that NPR is selling when they provide these side benefits. Okay, so another solution, kind of the opposite one, right? Now, instead of a political entrepreneur, we have a violent organization that links your payment to the public service with your continued freedom. If you don't pay, you go to jail. So now we see that the incentive structure, the effect of the new institution, the new rule on the incentive structure is the opposite. Everyone pays, you end up with the police. Nobody pays, I guess, in principle, everyone is in jail, including, I suppose, the police officers. I don't know who put them there. But most importantly, if you expect that some number of people are going to shirk on their responsibility and fail to pay while everyone else does, those people get thrown in jail. And that creates an assurance that you will not be a sucker, right? Because free riders don't just get off scot-free, they get sent to jail. They enjoy the advantage of having the public service, but they also end up in jail. So again, punishment disincentive does the same thing to the payoff structure for you, player one. You're always better off playing if you assume that the punishment for evading your contribution is strong enough and that you are likely enough to get caught to actually change your payoff structure in this way. There's a problem here that we should talk about really briefly, which is that the IRS is already providing a public good. The IRS provides the public good of changing the payoff structure so that people pay taxes. The IRS, the police, the people who would arrest you for shirking your taxes cost money. So in order to engage in these sort of punishment structures as an incentive changer, we already need to have solved a prior collective action problem that creates this enforcement mechanism in the first place. In comparative politics, we spend a lot of time talking about where services like the Internal Revenue Service come from. We're not going to bother with that for this class. We're just going to recognize that there is such a thing as a problem when you provide a public good of getting people to participate around the fact that they could enjoy the public good without paying in. Okay, one more sub-problem that we should deal with as long as we've come this far into the collective action problem and its solutions is the tragedy of the commons, a very similarly structured problem. Let's say that we have a fishery. The fishery creates 20 new fish every year that we can fish out of the water and eat to feed our families, and there are 5 families of fishermen who depend upon the fishery. How many fish per year per fisherman can we take before the fishery will start to collapse? 4, hopefully you answered, right? So here we have a new payoff structure. If we are cooperative, we take 4 fish. If we defect, we take more fish. We see already the similarity in the way the payoffs are structured. If everyone cooperates, we have a long-lasting fishery that feeds our village into perpetuity. Here we have a hell of a party, but the fish are gone in a few years because we've overfished our supply. Here, life is good for you because you're the only free rider. This is probably a little bit unrealistic. The fishery may not collapse, and the community may not get a payoff of 1. They may get something like a payoff of 4.5. You're screwing them over, but if you're the only one that's overfishing, it may not result in collapse. But if you're the only one that cooperates, the fishery definitely collapses, and you are a sucker. You could have at least been partying in the defect, but instead you decided like a moron to cooperate. So, similar logic here. No one wants to be the sucker that doesn't take what's available from the commons before it's gone. And if the stock is going to get depleted anyway, you may as well get what's yours. This is a problem that tends to afflict natural resources, clean air, forests, grazing land, these types of things. So we may sometimes wonder why it feels like the government is always siding with big businesses, and this relates to the way that the collective action problem and the tragedy of the commons are structured. Big businesses, concentrated interests, have a structural advantage in this game, whether the problem is air pollution or financial regulations or a host of other cases in which the industry fights regulation that would probably help the common people. One of the problems with large-scale collective action is that defection is hard to monitor. How do you make sure that the millions of people that care about dozens of different issues mobilize their votes or their money for each cause that might benefit them, right? We're all involved in a number of collective action problems all at the same time, a number of tragedy of the commons problems all at the same time. So we know that what we ought to be seeing is that people donate a little bit of money to get, say, a clean air regulation. And what they get back has a higher value to them in terms of clean air. On the other hand, the industry should donate lots of money to get lots of value back when the clean air regulation fails. That is, they don't have to change their business model, right? So concentration presents a really interesting problem. Say that you have to delegate out the duty of collecting and monitoring the contributions to your cause. You want to hire someone, a political entrepreneur or an IRS, to monitor who is contributing and who is not. The challenge of administering an industry group like this is straightforward. There are a handful of companies in the industry, and the concierge has the duty to make sure that each of them have contributed, and then there's some sort of set upon punishment if the contribution fails to be made. Still a problem, still a collective action problem here, but let's focus just on this collection issue at first. With a citizens group, this is a lot different. Every nature lover is expected to provide a little bit, right? Or do they? How do we know? We expect the concierge to keep track, but of course at some point, you have so many people that it's difficult for the concierge to keep track of who is contributing and who is not, whether that person is a political entrepreneur or whether that entity is a punisher like the IRS. But of course we have police, right? We have public services, and we know that there are times that big groups of citizens do successfully get together and petition for policy that matters. We have evidence that the government passes policies that help diffuse interests, that help us and harm big companies. So how do we get to these places, right? How do people manage these collective action problems? We'll talk about this issue more in coming weeks. Okay, that will be the end of our collective action problem set of slides. The next slide in this series of lectures, the next presentation in this series of lectures concerns macro causes of war. You're welcome to go through these presentations in any order you like, but that's sort of the way the next one is set up. All right, I will see you there.